Imagine living in a peaceful home where everything is in order and you're comfortable. Then, suddenly, a new housemate appears and disrupts your serene life. Sounds familiar? This is the reality of our protagonist, a young professional sharing a two-bedroom apartment with her roommate, Mia. They were both in harmony, splitting the rent according to their income and room size, with our protagonist shouldering 65% of the load due to her higher income and larger room. Life was organized, predictable, and comfortable. Then, out of the blue, Mia introduced a new housemate, Brian. From the moment he stepped into the apartment, things began to spiral into chaos. Brian was messy, invasive, and lacked basic hygiene etiquette. He would eat food that wasn't his, wander into off-limits rooms, and even barge into the bathroom during shower time. Our protagonist was patient, understanding that Brian was adjusting to the new environment. However, she also expected Mia to help Brian adapt to their shared living rules. Despite the constant disruption, she found herself constantly cleaning up after Brian, with Mia often leaving the extra housework and food preparation to her. The protagonist approached Mia gently, suggesting that if Brian was going to be a constant presence, it was only fair that Mia contributes more to the rent. After all, Brian's messiness was resulting in more work, and the apartment was no longer exclusively theirs. But when Brian crossed a line and marked the couch as his territory, the protagonist felt compelled to take a stronger stand. She demanded that Mia either control Brian's behavior or contribute more towards the rent. Mia's reaction was explosive, accusing her of being unfair and storming off in a huff. Despite the challenges, the protagonist continued to adapt to the new living situation, hoping things would improve. But the question remains, is it wrong for her to ask for a higher percentage of rent? Is asking for fairness in a shared living situation too much? Stick around as we delve deeper into this intriguing story in the next scene. Just when the protagonist thought things couldn't get worse, an incident occurred that pushed her beyond her limit. One day, she returned home to find a sight that would make any person's stomach churn. The couch, her sanctuary after long hours of coding, was tarnished. Brian, the uninvited guest turned semi-permanent resident, had committed the unthinkable. He had relieved himself on the couch, staining the fabric and permeating the room with an unbearable stench. The protagonist was shocked. This was not just an infringement of personal space, it was an insult to the sanctity of their shared living quarters. In a fit of rage, she decided to confront Mia once again. This wasn't about Brian's adjustment anymore. It was about respect and responsibility. She found Mia in her room, blissfully unaware of the disaster in the living room. The protagonist voiced her disgust and frustration, outlining the disrespect and inconvenience that Brian's actions had caused. She pointed out the unfairness of the situation, the fact that she was paying 65% of the rent, yet was dealing with more than her share of the mess and disruption. She suggested, not unreasonably, that Mia should contribute more to the rent, given that Brian was now a constant presence in the apartment. However, Mia's reaction was far from understanding. She instantly became defensive, accusing the protagonist of being unfair and unreasonable. She dismissed the protagonist's concerns, completely ignoring the fact that Brian's actions were affecting her roommate's quality of life. She slammed her door, leaving the protagonist standing in the hallway, feeling frustrated and unheard. The protagonist was left questioning herself, wondering if she was indeed being unfair. She mulled over the incident, the confrontation, and Mia's reaction. She couldn't help but feel that she was justified in asking for a fairer split of the rent. After all, she was bearing the brunt of the inconvenience caused by Brian's presence. The protagonist was left feeling frustrated and unheard, wondering if she was in the wrong for asking for a fairer split of the rent. Sometimes it's helpful to gain an outside perspective, but in this case, the protagonist's friend's comments only added to her confusion. Our protagonist had expected support from her friends, but was greeted with a chorus of differing opinions. While some friends empathized with her situation, others sided with Mia, suggesting that the protagonist was being unreasonably harsh on Brian. They pointed out that Brian was new to the apartment and was still adjusting to his surroundings. His messy habits, they suggested, were simply a part of his adjustment process. The criticism didn't stop there. Some friends even went as far as to question the protagonist's request for a higher percentage of rent from Mia. Is it fair to ask for more money just because Brian is messy? They asked. Is it right to put a price on someone's habits, especially when they're trying to adapt to a new environment? These questions left our protagonist in a whirlwind of self-doubt. She had thought she was being reasonable, asking for a fairer split since Brian's presence had increased her workload and disrupted her peaceful home. But now, her friend's comments had her second-guessing herself. The more she thought about it, the more she started to question her own actions. Was she being too harsh on Brian? Was she being unfair to Mia? Was she wrong for asking for a higher percentage of rent? The protagonist found herself stuck in a loop of self-doubt and confusion. She had stood her ground, trying to protect her space and peace of mind. But the more she pondered over her friend's words, the more she questioned her stance. In her heart, she knew that she was only asking for what she thought was fair. But her friend's opinions had shaken her resolve, leaving her unsure of her own judgment. This left the protagonist questioning, was she wrong for asking for a fairer split? Despite the challenges and criticism, the protagonist knew she had to stand up for herself. She had tolerated Brian's disruptive behavior for far too long, and the time had come to assert her rights. She was not asking for the moon and stars, merely a fair division of rent. She reasoned that since Brian had become a permanent fixture in the apartment, it was only just that Mia should contribute more towards the rent. After all, wasn't it only fair that those who used the space more should pay more? She had no qualms about Mia and Brian sharing the apartment, but she did have an issue with the additional mess and disruption that came with Brian's presence. She found herself spending more time cleaning up after Brian, time that she could have spent relaxing or focusing on her work. The protagonist also had to deal with the invasion of her privacy, something that she valued highly. Brian had an annoying habit of wandering into her room and even the bathroom while she was using them. This was not just about money, but about respect and personal boundaries too. She had approached Mia gently several times, asking her to either rein in Brian's behavior or contribute more to the rent. When Mia responded with anger and accusations of unfairness, she knew she had to stand her ground. The protagonist wasn't being greedy or unreasonable. She was simply asking for a fair split of the rent, considering the change in living conditions. She believed that she had a right to a comfortable and secure living environment, something that had been disrupted since Brian's arrival. And so, she decided to stand firm on her demand for a 50-50 split. She wasn't asking Mia to shoulder the entire burden, just to share it equally. She realized that she wasn't being unfair, but simply asking for respect and understanding in her own home. After all, home is where the heart is, and her heart longed for a peaceful and respectful environment. In the end, the protagonist was faced with a difficult decision: to stand her ground or to compromise her comfort. Our protagonist, a young professional in tech, found her peaceful home disrupted by the arrival of Mia's new roommate Brian. Despite being caught in a whirlwind of chaos and unhygienic behaviors, she had initially shown understanding and patience, believing that Brian was merely adjusting to his new surroundings. However, as time passed, it became clear that his disruptive behavior was not a temporary phase, but rather a permanent fixture. When Brian crossed the line by disrespecting her personal space and contributing to the mess in their shared home, she felt compelled to address the issue. She approached Mia, her roommate, and requested a fairer division of rent, given the additional burden Brian had placed on their living situation. This was not a demand made out of spite, but rather a plea for consideration and respect. However, her request was met with resistance. Mia, unable to see the unfairness of the situation, accused our protagonist of being unreasonable. It led to a heated argument that left our protagonist feeling misunderstood and isolated. Despite this, she held firm in her belief that her request was justified. The protagonist's friends offered varying perspectives, some siding with Mia and Brian, others understanding her plight. Yet she had to make a decision based on her personal experience and the impact on her quality of life. She believed that she deserved to live in an environment where she felt respected and comfortable, and that involved Mia taking responsibility for Brian's actions and contributing more to the rent. Despite the challenges, she believed asking Mia to pay a higher percentage of rent was fair. After all, everyone deserves to live in a home where they feel respected and comfortable. In the end, it was about standing up for her rights, asserting her boundaries, and ensuring a harmonious living situation for all parties involved.